let's jump right into today's explainer, where we're unpacking something so many of us have dealt with, yet totally struggle to understand in the heat of the moment. We're talking about the absolute fastest, most effective way to identify a narcissist by tuning into early behavioral clues. Look, if you've ever been blindsided by someone's toxic behavior, you know exactly how incredibly jarring and exhausting it can be, right? It drains your energy, it leaves you completely second-guessing your own judgment. But as we dig into the research together, we're going to discover there is actually a highly reliable, structured way to spot these individuals way before things get complicated. So get ready, because we are unpacking the exact framework you need to protect your time and, honestly, your peace of mind. Did the mask suddenly slip? Man, it describes such a profound and confusing feeling. You meet someone new, maybe it's a romantic partner, a new boss, or even a friend. They seem fantastic, charming, attentive, maybe even a perfect fit for a while. And then, seemingly out of absolutely nowhere, it's like a mask just falls right off their face. A totally different, often toxic person is suddenly standing right in front of you. It literally leaves you spinning, wondering, wait, who is this person and where on earth did they come from? We tend to think that some specific event triggered this brand new personality to just emerge out of thin air. Well, okay, let's dive right into this. That sudden change, it's a complete illusion. Our human brains are literally wired to notice sudden, loud threats, which is exactly why we miss the quiet, gradual buildup of red flags. The reality of human behavior is actually much more predictable and, honestly, way more empowering once you know exactly what you're looking for. The signs of narcissism, they don't just magically appear in a single dramatic moment when that so-called mask slips. They are actually there long, long before that explosive moment ever happens. You just need the right lens to see them. To get that lens, we need a specific psychological framework: pattern recognition. This basically means identifying predictable, repeating behaviors that happen regardless of the situation. Think of it kind of like a glitch in a video game. No matter what level you're on or what environment you're exploring, the character just keeps making the exact same strange, repetitive movement. This right here is your core tool. You know, as humans, when we interact with people, we naturally tend to evaluate them based on individual, isolated events. We instinctively want to give them the benefit of the doubt. But to spot toxic, narcissistic behavior early on, you have to stop looking at those isolated incidents. You got to zoom out and start looking for the behavioral loop. It's all about seeing the forest, not just the individual trees. So when we try to understand someone's behavior, we often get totally distracted by context. Context is everything constantly changing around us. It's the new environments, dealing with different people, maybe the stress of a bad day at work, or the high of a new project. We so often excuse bad behavior by blaming that context. We'll say things like, oh, they just had a really stressful week, or they don't know these people yet, so they acted a little weird. But the secret? The secret is looking for the pattern, the predictable reactions, and the exact same outcomes time and time again. A core narcissistic behavior loop stubbornly repeats itself. It literally couldn't care less about the context. What's really interesting about this is how a fascinating triad of early red flags emerges when we look deeper into this framework: grandiosity, lack of empathy, and a need for control. This isn't just some random list of bad traits. Psychologists actually point to this as the definitive core script of narcissistic behavior. These three elements almost always appear super early on, basically hiding in plain sight while you are busy paying attention to all those changing situations around you. They are the underlying gears driving that repeating behavioral loop we were just talking about. Once you really internalize these three flags, you're going to start recognizing the machinery of their behavior everywhere you go. Let's break this triad down, starting with red flag number 1, grandiosity. Now, in the early days of knowing someone, this might not look like cartoonish, over-the-top arrogance. It often looks subtly charming. It might be someone who has a ton of big ideas, someone who casually but frequently name drops, or someone who somehow constantly steers a conversation about your really hard day right back to their own achievements. The pattern of grandiosity is incredibly rigid. It's this inflated sense of self-importance that just constantly requires outside validation. If you watch closely, you'll spot a consistent behavioral loop where they subtly elevate themselves while finding clever little ways to diminish others, literally no matter what the topic of conversation actually is. And that connects directly to our second flag, a lack of empathy. This is arguably the absolute most destructive piece of the entire puzzle. And again, it doesn't always mean they're outwardly cruel or aggressive right at the start. Often, it just manifests as an inherent inability to truly recognize, validate, or care about the feelings and needs of anyone else. Notice how they react when you share a vulnerability, or watch closely how they treat a waiter who makes a tiny mistake with their order. Do they become disproportionately cold or dismissive? If you apply pattern recognition here, you're going to find a fundamental lack of empathy consistently woven right into their reactions. They simply cannot put themselves in someone else's shoes, and the pattern will prove it time and time again. The final piece of this behavioral puzzle is the need for control. This acts as an inescapable, repeating behavior regardless of whatever the context happens to be. Early on, it might masquerade as them just being exceptionally helpful or, taking charge of planning a great date or a business meeting. But remember, watch the pattern, not the excuse. What actually happens when you suggest a totally different alternative? What happens when a simple dinner plan changes and things don't go exactly on their timeline? That desperate need to dictate the terms, control the narrative, and manage your perceptions of them will show up over and over and over again. I want to pause right here for a second and speak directly to your lived experience. If you have ever been through a relationship or a toxic working environment with a person like this, it is not in your head. So many survivors of toxic individuals spend literally years gaslighting themselves. They wonder if they made it all up, if they were just being too sensitive, or worst of all, if they were actually the problem. This explainer isn't just about identifying a narcissist for the future. It's about providing deep emotional validation for what you've already experienced. And this brings us to a concept we call the reframe. This brings us to a vital realization. The pattern was visible from day one. That grandiosity, that distinct lack of empathy, that rigid need for control, they didn't just spontaneously generate the day the relationship finally went sour. Nope. Those toxic behaviors were deeply ingrained in the person's character, and they were actively present right from the very beginning. They were playing out in small, micro interactions that you might have politely brushed off or excused, mostly because you were focused on the context of the situation rather than the pattern of the person. And that leads to this incredibly empowering realization: you just weren't looking for it. You weren't crazy, you weren't overly dramatic, and you certainly weren't imagining things. The evidence was literally always there, playing out on a predictable loop. You simply didn't have the psychological tools or the specific framework to recognize the pattern yet. You were looking at the changing situations, being a good person, giving them the benefit of the doubt, instead of mapping out the reoccurring behaviors. But now you have the framework. You have the knowledge. Which brings us to a final provocative thought. Now that you know the pattern, what will you see? Next time you walk into a professional meeting, go on a first date, or engage with your extended family, you are now equipped with a brand new lens. You know that the mask doesn't suddenly slip. The real face was actually there the whole time, hidden in plain sight through repetitive, predictable actions. So I challenge you to enthusiastically apply this pattern recognition to your own life, starting right today. Start looking past the excuses in the context and pay really close attention to that behavioral loop. Because when you do, you'll see people for who they truly are, long before they can cause you harm. Thanks so much for diving into this explainer with me. Keep observing and keep growing.